Greetings, folks, and welcome to another episode of the Lessons from the Cockpit Show. This is episode 53. I am your host, Mark Hesera, and for over 60 years, my passion has been everything aviation. I love airplanes. On the Lessons from the Cockpit Show, we debrief some of the most intriguing and fascinating pilots, aircrew members, maintainers, and aviation enthusiasts from all over the world. Our purpose on this show is to hear their stories, but more importantly, what did they learn from these extreme and extraordinary military, commercial, and even private flying events? One of the great things about our show is you're going to hear stories from veterans, and you're going to hear them here for the very first time. The reason we do this is to show how does the aviation world work, but more importantly, increase critical thinking skills both in the air and on the ground. The Lessons from the Cockpit Show is supported and financed by Wall Pilot, custom aviation art for the walls of your home, office, and hangar. Go to wallpilot.com and order some of these 4, 6, and 8 foot profiles of airplanes that are printed on vinyl that you can peel off and stick to any flat surface. These are extremely detailed aircraft profiles. There's even the arming handles on the Sidewinder missiles with all the stenciling that tells you how to do it. So go by wallpilot.com and order 1 or 2 of our 4, 6, or 8 foot prints that are printed on vinyl that you can peel off and stick to any flat surface. Some people just frame them the way that they are. We also do custom profiles. Your name, the unit you're from, tail number, even weapons loads, we customize on these prints. On today's show, we're going to talk about the second part of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I'm going to go through the Strategic Air Command's nuclear air operations during the Cuban crisis of 1962. And folks, this is going to raise the hair on the back of your head when you find out how many nuclear bombs were in the air at one time and how much gas was offloaded during the 30 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis in October and November of 1962. So, grab an adult beverage of your choice, sit down, strap in, and let's begin the Lessons from the Cockpit Show as we talk once again about nuclear operations during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. We had an idea something was going on, and the CIA director, John McCone, was trying to put his finger on it, but he just couldn't. He's trying to connect all the dots, and then they see SA-2 sites going up. And of course, SA-2 sites look like nothing else in this world because it's a Star of David, and each of the 6 points has a missile launcher with the Fansong radar right in the middle. And these ferret missions are gathering up all the electrons that the Spoon Rest long-range acquisition radar is spitting out, and the Fansong target tracking radars are emitting also. Premier Nikita Khrushchev knows he's got to get all of this stuff on Cuba before the Americans find out. He needs this to be a huge surprise that these missiles, bombers, and fighters are there waiting to smack us in the face before we know what's going on. The entire face of this event changes early in the morning of the 14th of October when Major Richard Heiser flies the very first U-2 mission over Cuba. He's only over Cuba less than 7 minutes, but he collects beautiful pictures of the San Cristobal medium-range ballistic missile site. And those pictures are brought into President Kennedy, and they realize what's going on. Gromyko flat out lied to President Kennedy when he said there are no offensive weapons in Cuba. We now have photographic proof that, in fact, there are. And on the 15th of October, Major Heiser and Major Rudolph Anderson fly 2 U-2 missions the length of Cuba, take pictures of every square mile of it. Not only are there medium range, but there's intermediate range ballistic missiles. There are IL-28 Beagle bombers. There are MiG-21 fishbed fighters on the island of Cuba. And the Blue Moon low-level F-8 missions prove that there are revetments being built to store the nuclear warheads for the Sandal missiles. I don't know if you've been watching this in the news, but I just read an article that said Pentagon distancing itself from Air Mobility Command commander who says we will go to war with China in 2025. As you can expect, folks, this 4-star commander of Air Mobility Command is getting a lot of heat in the press right now for this. Last summer, I had the opportunity to meet and spend some time with General Mike Minahan, who is the current commander of Air Mobility Command, man who sent out this memo that's dated the 1st of February, 2023. And what I'd like to do is just read you portions of this. It says, subject, February 2023 orders in preparation for the next fight. In his paragraph 1, it says, situation, I hope I am wrong. My gut tells me we will fight in 2025. Chinese President Xi Jinping secured his third term and set his war council in October of 2022. Taiwan's presidential elections are in 2024 and will offer Xi a reason. United States presidential elections are in 2024 and will offer Xi a distracted America. Xi's team, reason, and opportunity are all aligned for 2025. And I found this next sentence to be very interesting. We will spend 2023 in crisp operational motion building on that foundation. If you want to know what the operational motion I demand looks like, look at what Total Force Team Charleston did in January. This month, Team Charleston put 40 C-17s on the taxiway and runways in an elephant walk. Most impressive. Here is General Minahan's commander's intent in paragraph 2. Go faster. Drive readiness, integration, and ability for ourselves and the joint force to deter and, if required, defeat China. Mentions them specifically. This is the first of 8 monthly directives from me. You need to know I alone own the pen on these orders. My expectations are high. These orders are not up for negotiation. Follow them. I will be tough, fair, and loving in my approach to secure victory. And then he gives his end state in paragraph 3. A fortified, ready, integrated, and agile joint force maneuver team ready to fight and win inside the first island chain. Maximize the use of force and the tools we currently have and extract full value from things that currently exist. Close the gaps. Command and control, navigation, maneuver under attack, and tempo. In his 4th paragraph, he says, run deliberately, not recklessly. You will be governed by the principles of calculated training risk, which you shall interpret to mean the avoidance of death, serious injury, and Class A damage to attain high readiness, integration, and agility. If the tactic, technique, and procedure you are developing increases MC's ability to fight and win inside the first island chain, move out. If you are comfortable in your approach to training, then you are not taking enough risk. Here is one of the things that is getting a lot of attention. In this coming month, February, he says all AMC aligned personnel with weapons qualifications will fire a clip into a 7-meter target with the full understanding that unrepentant lethality matters most. Aim for the head. That has been the banner of almost every article I have seen written on this memo. Aim for the head. Being an old KC-135 guy, I found his March projected efforts very fascinating. KC-135 units will coordinate to provide a conceptual means of air delivering 100 off-the-shelf size and type unmanned aerial vehicles from a single aircraft. Isn't that fascinating? We're going to use tankers to increase our mobility, something tankers have been doing for a while, moving cargo and patients. General Minahan ends this memo with just 2 words. Let's go! Exclamation point. I think Air Mobility Command's new motto will become let's go, which I applaud. And I applaud this letter that he has sent out all of his commanders. In General Minahan's memo, he mentions that Premier Xi Jinping has been reelected for a 3rd term and that in October, they began to have their war council. Well, I want to read to you another message from October of 1962, the 24th to be exact. General Thomas S. Power is the commander of Strategic Air Command during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this is what he goes on to say. I am addressing you for the purpose of reemphasizing the seriousness of the situation this nation faces. We are in an advanced state of readiness to meet any emergencies, and I feel that we are well prepared. I expect each of you to maintain strict security and use calm judgment during these tense periods. Our plans are well prepared and are being executed smoothly. If there are any questions concerning instructions which by nature of the situation deviate from the normal, use the telephone for clarification. Review your plans for further action to ensure that there will be no mistakes or confusion. I expect you to cut out all non-essentials and put yourself in maximum readiness condition. If you are not sure of what you should do in any situation, and if time permits, get in touch with us here. Signed, General Thomas S. Power. This was the primary alert message General Power sent out on the 24th of October as the Cuban Missile Crisis was going on. I just find it fascinating. There's a lot of parallels and similarities between General Minahan's letter and this one, particularly their seriousness. Be prepared. We don't know what's going to happen, but we know something's going to happen. And I find it interesting that October of 62 and October of 2022, there's war councils going on, just as General Minahan mentioned in his memo. And this is where I want to continue talking about Strategic Air Command's bomber and tanker operations during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Presence of offensive, nuclear-capable ballistic missiles has now been confirmed on the island of Cuba. Gromyko lied, and now the president and everybody in our government knows that because they have photographic proof. On the 14th and 15th, Heiser and Anderson have the photos, have the photographic proof. They see the missiles, they see the propellant tanks, they see all kinds of tractors. All the infrastructure that they need for ballistic missiles in Cuba is there on film now. On the afternoon of the 16th of October, General Power meets with the Joint Chiefs in the tank at the Pentagon. And they ask him, what should we do? Where should we go from here? And General Power gives the Joint Chiefs his recommendations. Those three recommendations are generate all forces and declare DEFCON 2. Increase B-47 dispersal plan, something that they'd already been working on. The third thing is enlarge and mount airborne alert, or the Chrome Dome missions, beginning right now. And as the discussion goes on, they realize that if they are to get the proper forces into the southeast, specifically Florida, they need to move and evacuate a good portion of Strategic Air Command's forces that are at Homestead Air Force Base, a SAC base, McCoy Air Force Base, now Orlando International Airport, and MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, Florida. These forces all need to be moved because of the amount of forces that are going to be coming into Florida. Because again, at this point in time, they don't know what they're going to do yet. They're talking about another invasion, so that means troops in Florida. They're talking about the blockade, or the quarantine, as we now know it as. They're going through all of their options. What course of action are we going to choose? Well, we have to get ready so that whatever we do, we have the forces in place in Florida to be able to do it. As the Cuban Missile Crisis is starting, Strategic Air Command is looking at its next revision for the Single Integrated Operations Plan, in other words, the nuclear war plan for the United States. One of the things that Strategic Air Command and Tactical Air Command were discussing was the withdrawal of Strategic Air Command forces out of the South and the Southeast region. These discussions are going on as the Cuban Missile Crisis develops and hits. 2 days before the first U-2 flight on 12th of October, Brigadier General William Crum, who's the chief of SAC's Ops and Plans, was developing an evacuation plan for Florida. They'd already been working on it. They didn't even have the pictures yet of Cuba, but this is something they'd already been working on how we move our forces from MacDill, McCoy, and Homestead Air Force Base, and where will we put them? Where will we take them to? So as General Power is meeting with all the chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Crum and his organization are completing those plans on the 16th. Plan A is to just stay in place. Don't go anywhere. Plan B is all SAC forces evacuate out of Florida. And the reason for that is they need to make room for air defense units. They need to make room for Army units and Navy units that are going to come into the area during the crisis. The crisis is now pushing the development of those plans faster. From Air Defense Command, you've got interceptors that are going to come down there. F-102s, F-101s, F-106s, all of these different airplanes that are come down there, and they're going to be on alert because there's a Beagle bomber threat, obviously. Hawk missile batteries, the Army's surface-to-air missile batteries, are also going to move into the area, and 10 to 12,000 Army troops are going to come down in case there's an invasion of the island again. On the 19th of October, the plan is approved that they will move Strategic Air Command forces out of Florida, those 3 bases, to make room for those that are coming in. All the bombers are going to deploy as individual flights. They're going to deploy with the bombs in what they call a travel configuration. I don't know what that configuration, that safe configuration is, if there's a pin they've got on the bomb or whatever, but they are told you will travel with your weapons. 2 days later, on the 21st, 33 bombers and 7 tankers deploy and are put back on alert in their EWO configuration with their bombs ready to go, not in the travel configuration. On the next day, the 22nd, Power moves all of the aircraft that are on alert at McCoy, Homestead, and MacDill to their new locations. Now, these plans have 2 different names. Option 1 was, of course, just an orderly flow. They would move out, and it was called Gay Crowd, of all things. Option 2, which is executed for a fast reaction response in case something happens, was called Crisp Bacon. Fortunately, there's an orderly flow, and all of the forces that are on alert move to their new locations and are now back on EWO alert. By the 24th of October, all of SAC forces are now out of McCoy, MacDill, and Homestead. So let's talk about the B-52s first. The B-52s that are at McCoy, their D models, went to Turner Air Force Base in Savannah, Georgia, and to Shepherd Air Force Base in Texas. The Homestead B-52Hs went to Wurtsmith, and they went there for a reason. I'm going to get into that here in just a second. There was something going on with the H models that I'll mention here in just a second. They all redeploy to Hunter Air Force Base in Georgia. 7 KC-135s at Homestead go to Bergstrom, with 2 additional KC-135s from Homestead going all the way up to Loring Air Force Base in Limestone, Maine. The Strategic Air Command units that were at Eglin Air Force Base in Valparaiso, Florida, and Ramey Air Force Base in Puerto Rico stayed in place. And Ramey would become very important for tankers during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I'll get into that in just a second. So what forces move in behind all of these SAC forces that move out? McCoy Air Force Base gets the 966 AWACS Squadron from the 551st AWACS Wing that's at Otis Air Force Base. These are EC-121 versions of the Airborne Warning Control Platform that the E3s that we now have replaced. U-2 launch and recovery units are also at McCoy Air Force Base. The 4th Fighter Wing out of Seymour Johnson Air Force Base brings down 67 F-105s. The 354th TAC Fighter Wing brings down 63 F-100s, and the 427th Air Refueling Squadron brings in 20 KB-50s. Tactical Air Command is still using prop-driven tankers, and I'm going to talk about that also here in just a second. Homestead Air Force Base down the very tip of Florida gets 180 fighter airplanes, and there's 1,600 pilots that now move him to Homestead Air Force Base. The U.S. Army stages also at Homestead Air Force Base with, I think it's around 10,000 Army troops with C-19 cargo planes to carry these troops in case we invade Cuba again. Now, if you've ever seen MacDill Air Force Base, it's massive. The runway is massive. Normally, runways are 150 feet wide. MacDill Air Force Base runway is 300 feet wide, so that you could stack a lot of B-47s on the taxiways and runways and have them take off in formation. It's really weird flying into Tampa, into MacDill Air Force Base, because when you're landing, your sight picture for landing is different because the runway is twice the size as a normal runway, from 150 feet normal runway to 300 feet. And it's got this massive, massive ramp. 60 F-100s come all the way from George Air Force Base and start setting up shop. 64 RF-101 Voodoos and RB-66 electronic countermeasure airplanes also move in. Tactical Air Command moves 20 KB-50Js in there, and the J model has probe and drogue and has jet engines on them. That's why they're J models. The 12th and 15th TAC fighter wings are also on the ramp at MacDill. That's the East Coast replacement training unit for the brand new Phantoms. Now, let's come back to the B-47 dispersal. On the 22nd of October at 18Z, there's a 4-hour time difference between the East Coast, so it's 1400 local, 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the 22nd of October. 183 B-47s at 15 bases begin dispersing to other locations. Most of them are civilian airfields. Many of them are guard and reserve bases. The 183 B-47s depart from those 15 bases in their EWO configuration with their nukes on board. And within 24 hours, all of them have now set up shop at their new locations at these civilian airfields. But of course, there are some issues when you take nuclear-armed airplanes into civilian airfields, the biggest being, how do you secure the airplanes? Here is a case in point. 3 nuclear-armed B-47s with their accompanying KB-97 tankers were supposed to go into West Palm Beach, Florida, but they couldn't. They didn't have a means of securing the airplanes, and they didn't have enough ramp space for them either. The other problem that you have going into some airfields, particularly where tankers are concerned, is the airfield doesn't hold enough gas. So West Palm Beach was kind of declared a no-go location, and they had to find another place to put these 3 B-47s with nukes and their accompanying tankers somewhere else. I don't know where they sent them to. I tried to find out where, but was unable. So think about this. 183 nuclear-armed airplanes are now showing up at various civilian airfields around the nation. Many of them have guard units or reserve units there, but now a whole set of security rules needs to be put in place. You have to be able to take care of the airplanes and the nuclear weapons, so all of the maintenance and ammo folks are going with you, and you have to have enough fuel to put in the KC-97 tankers, and that also creates another issue. I've said in previous episodes, smart men study tactics, brilliant men and women study logistics. And this is a prime example of where that issue raised its ugly head. First item, we don't have all the KC-135s yet. It's 1962, and the KC-135 is continuing to be produced on the Boeing assembly line. We only have about half of the 700 KC-135s that we're going to have in the inventory. They are taking off with their maximum fuel capacity because they're transferring anywhere between 100 to 110,000 pounds of gas, which for an A model is a lot of gas. To give you an example, I offloaded 103,500 pounds to a B-52 that was on its way from Castle Air Force Base to Sydney, Australia for an exercise I do down there called Pitch Black. We met the B-52 20 minutes northeast of the island of Guam. It took us 22 minutes pumping 6,000 pounds a minute, then letting the tank settle a little bit, and then pumping more into the B-52 to get all of his gas offloaded, all 103,500 pounds. By that time, we were only about 20 minutes, 30 minutes south of the island of Guam, but we were almost out of gas. Our island destination fuel, which we had to have, meant that we had to be able to hold for an hour and 30 minutes, and the KC-135A models burned about 12,000 pounds an hour. We had to keep an extra 18,000 pounds of gas on board to meet that island destination fuel requirement. We came back like right on the bubble for fuel. I think we landed with about 22,000 pounds of gas in the tanks, but it was okay. Winds were right down the runway, what we call clear and visibility unlimited day, CAVU day. We took the risk, but because of that large offload, we had to do it real close to Andersen Air Force Base. The same thing's going on during the Cuban Missile Crisis because the B-52s are taking these massive 100,000, 105,000, 110,000 pound offloads. The majority of the Strategic Air Command tankers are the KB-97 reciprocating engine, now two jets motors on the wing that propel the airplane. The problem you have here is the reciprocating engines and the jet engines burn two different kinds of gas. The KB-97 has these big, huge fuel tanks in the body of the airplane that hold the JP4, JP5 kerosene that they pump into the B-47s because that's what the B-47s operate on. The KC-97 has reciprocating engine fuels like avgas in the wing tanks and everything because that's what their reciprocating engines burn. You have to put two different types of gas on the KB-97s, and because the KB-97s are refueling the B-47s, they can't go much above 18,000 feet fully loaded. There's a problem with the B-47s being so fast and the KC-97s being so slow that they have to do this toboggan maneuver in order to stay connected. The third tanker is the KB-50Js. The KB-50 is a B-50 airframe, a lot like the B-29, again, reciprocating engines. They have big, massive tanks in the two bomb bays where they can offload gas to the jets. Again, the jet fighters are burning a different type of gas. So the B-50s are burning fuel for their reciprocating engines. They've got their jet engines, so they're burning kerosene and avgas, and they're also pumping kerosene out of those body tanks into the fighters. Fortunately, the fighters are only taking, 8,000 to 9,000 pounds. Most of the fighters are using the probe and drogue method, so they're pumping about 1,000 to 1,500 pounds per minute, which doesn't take very long. There's still this problem of reciprocating engine tankers having to burn one type of gas with them offloading into fighters a completely different type of gas that they cannot burn in their engines. This is the logistics problem that they have during the Cuban Missile Crisis. 3 different tankers, 2 of those burning reciprocating engine gas, offloading kerosene into the jet engines of the fighters and the bombers. From the 14th through the 20th, everything's starting to build up now. They've increased the U-2 overflights. They're about to start the Blue Moon low altitude reconnaissance flights. They've got plenty of information that's telling them there are strategic ballistic missiles on the island of Cuba. They're building all of their courses of action, looking at all the different things that they could do. They're very reluctant to do an invasion because of the Bay of Pigs and how that went. But they're still looking at what do we do to keep this from spiraling out of control. They finally come up with the blockade, or quarantine as they call it, but they still have to position troops. They still have to position airplanes. There's a number of things that they are doing during this time period. And Florida is about to sink under the weight of all the military materiel and men that are being moved down there. And the president tells the media on the 22nd of October at 2300 Z, or 7 o'clock local Washington, D.C. time, he's going to make his speech about what's going on. One of those courses of action is acceptance by Power, the JCS acceptance of Power's recommendations for what to do with Strategic Air Command. About 1 o'clock in the afternoon on the 22nd of October, all of the orders are starting to go out to the forces on what they're about to do, and everything hinges on the president's speech. 2 of those recommendations. The first one, 1/8 airborne alert. Chrome Dome missions are going to increase exponentially. Second recommendation, dispersing all of the B-47s and their tied KC-97 tankers to dispersal bases. Those dispersal bases include both in the United States and overseas. And those orders are received at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 6 hours prior to President Kennedy going on TV. Now there's a flurry of activity because they're being told we are going to go from DEFCON 2 posture to the increased DEFCON 3 posture when the president begins speaking. So at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, everybody gets their orders that they're going to go from DEFCON 3 to DEFCON 2. And all of these airplanes are going to start moving with their tied tankers, maintenance to the dispersal bases. There's going to be a lot of activity at the Strategic Air Command bases. This activity includes loading weapons, getting tankers ready to refuel, all kinds of things. And those of you out there that are listening to this podcast who were in Strategic Air Command in the 80s when I was, know how busy bases get during a generation preparing for launch. At 7 p.m. Washington, D.C. time, President Kennedy goes in front of the American people, American citizens, here's what's going on. And as soon as he starts talking, B-52s are taking off on this 1/8 airborne alert chrome dome posture. B-47s are dispersing to their, in some cases, civilian airfields that have guard and reserve units on them with their accompanying tankers. Naval battle groups are moving into the Caribbean and they're beginning flight operations off of the aircraft carriers. The P-2 maritime patrol airplanes and the new P-3s are starting to fly their patrol missions looking for all of the Russian ships. And more importantly, what do they have on the decks of the Russian ships? As I mentioned before in the previous episode, if you can figure out what's on the decks of the ship, it's a pretty good idea of what they are carrying in the holds of those ships too. So imagine what Moscow must be thinking, because it's early in the morning there when all of a sudden SAC airplanes start launching. And President Kennedy was trying to send a clear message to them. We're not going to tolerate this. We're going to be forceful in using our forces to show you that we mean business. This is not a Bay of Pigs type of situation. We mean business. We are trying to keep World War III from happening. And President Kennedy even says in his speech, any hostile move would be met by, quote, whatever action is needed, unquote. The JCS on the 23rd at 10 o'clock in the morning tells Strategic Air Command to generate all of its forces, and they declare an A hour, an alert hour. So now SAC only remained in DEFCON 3 for about 39 hours before the president's speech. But Power has already got the ball rolling. He's already getting everybody prepared for what's about to happen. And on the 24th, he reads that alert letter to his entire forces that I read at the beginning of this episode. All of the other services are now busy too, because he's declared that they're going to do this quarantine or blockade, and it begins at midnight on the 22nd. Over 200 ships are moving down into the Caribbean to enforce this blockade. Aircraft carrier battle groups, destroyers, cruisers, and all of the support that they need are moving down into the Caribbean. Folks, you have to understand, this kind of generation of military force was unprecedented at the time. Strategic Air Command had not generated any kind of forces since the Lebanon crisis of 1958, and they had never launched an eighth of their fleet for airborne alert, plus all the supporting airplanes to keep those bombers airborne. This was an incredible feat and a show of military force, the likes nobody had ever seen before. So beginning at 1 o'clock Eastern time, everybody's getting ready for the president's speech in 4 hours. And something interesting had just taken place too. The airborne alert plans had just undergone a big revision, because they're looking at the PSYOP revision for the following year of 1963. They wanted to use the same airborne alert routes, why reinvent the wheel? And now that we're in a crisis situation, let's not change anything. The crews are already used to doing these things. They've already got muscle memory for the southern route, the northern route, and the Thule monitoring station. So let's keep them the same. Let's not change a whole lot of this. But now we're just going to increase the number of sorties and the number of airplanes that are flying on all of these different routes. So to give you an idea of how big this change was, under the normal Chrome Dome program, 12 B-52s launched per day during the normal Chrome Dome program and missions. 4 B-52s went on the south route through the Mediterranean into the Aegean Sea. 6 took the north route up to the North Pole and around Alaska. And 2 were on the Thule ballistic missile warning site near Greenland. Supporting KC-135s for all of these missions were located in Spain, Alaska, and then across northeast bases, northeast United States. On the southern route, the B-52s were met over the Pyrenees Mountains of Spain to refuel. They would get another mid-mission refueling somewhere around Gibraltar, and then that would be enough gas to get them home. For the north route over the poles in Alaska, the B-52s would be refueled somewhere around Nova Scotia to Newfoundland, and then once again over Alaska near Mount McKinley. The Thule monitoring B-52s were refueled by Northeast tankers and by Alaska tankers, and they only needed the one refueling during their mission. Going to 1/8 airborne alert required a lot of gas. I mentioned to you before, they're getting between 100 to 110,000 pounds. So in our calculations, we're just going to use 105,000 pound offloads to the B-52s. And remember, some of these are 3-ship cells of B-52s flying these missions. Fuel limitations at Eielson were extremely worrisome because they didn't have a place to store all the gas that they needed. So they had to do some pretty interesting fuel storage plans at Eielson Air Force Base. Spain went from 6 tankers to 38 tankers, split evenly, 19 at Morone and 19 at Torrejon. Eielson went from 7 to 10 tankers, and the Northeast went from 6 to 13 at Westover, Griffiths, and Loring. Eventually, the Northeast Tanker Task Force, to support the Chrome Dome missions, went to 16 tankers. 20 more were added for another mission that I'll talk about here in just a few minutes. Now, taking Morone and Torrejon to 19 tankers each required, obviously, Spanish approval. So there's international implications here that you have to deal with in your plans, going to the Spanish government and saying, hey, this is what's about to happen. We need to put 19 tankers at Morone, 19 tankers at Torrejon, plus all of their support. Now, being prepared military airfields, they had plenty of storage for fuel there. That wasn't a problem. But they still needed Spain's permission to put those airplanes in there. There's always country clearance issues whenever you're deploying overseas. The very first B-52 unit to launch was the 4134th Stratwing out of Mather. They launched the very first 3-ship cell of B-52s at 1824Z on the 22nd of October, going on the north route. So at 2:24 Eastern Standard Time, B-52s were already launching for the north route. Now again, they have to go across the United States and then up the Canadian eastern border to get in their position. But still, things are happening before the president is talking. Just a matter of minutes before he's talking. He's talking at 1900 local. To prepare for the southern route, they had to get those 38 tankers in place. The southern route didn't have B-52s on it for 4 hours and 30 minutes after the president talked, because they had to get all of those tankers in place, crews ready to go, all the airplanes refueled. So the southern route was about 4.5 to 5 hours behind the launching of the northern route. And this is all B-52D models, because the H models were going through the straight pin modification still. So here are the daily numbers of B-52s flying airborne alert with as many as 4 nuclear weapons on each of the aircraft. And this is just from the 22nd of October to about the 4th of November, because on the first week of November, it increased. There was 66 B-52 missions a day. 28 B-52s were going north, 36 were going south, 2 were going to the Thule monitoring station. And some of these were 3-ship cells of B-52s, each of them carrying 2 to 4 weapons. I mentioned earlier that the B-52H models were being restricted during this time period, and there's a good reason for that. The B-52H models had just undergone an engine change. with the current engines that they are flying with now. When they inspected the wings of the H models, they found that there was cracks in a pin that holds the wing to the fuselage. They had to go and inspect all of the B-52H models for this cracking pin. And it's called a taper lock fastener. And it's some kind of bolt that they had to go and fix. So all of the B-52H models were undergoing what was called the straight pin modification to deal with this crack problem. As the H models became available, they started flying chrome dome missions one a day. The H model squadrons were told you had to fly at least one mission a day until they had at least 6 airplanes with the straight pin modification, and then they could fly 2 a day. They would generate 2 sorties a day of the H models, and subsequently all of the H models got this straight pin modification, and they began flying in the mix as well with the new engines. By the 5th of November, all B-52 units were operational, and the number of sorties went to 75, from 66 to 75 sorties a day, with 42 on the south, 31 going north, and the Thule monitoring station stayed the same at 2. So now let's discuss the tanker bill for this. And these are going to be some incredible numbers. Spain was required to refuel each of the B-52s that were coming their way with at least 2 air refuelings per bomber. Again, between 100 to 110,000 pounds. That means there was 84 sorties flying out of Spain a day. The Northeast Tanker Task Force was flying 1 AR on the north route, 31 missions a day. Alaska had 1 AR up north near Mount McKinley, but they also had to supply one for the Thule monitoring B-52 during this increase in B-52 sorties. Now, on the 24th of October, SAC approved a directive that allowed the crews a little leeway. One of those things concerns the boom. They could do manual override and manual boom latching. Manual override is where the receiver comes to an upward, downward, or right or left limit. The system would normally fire through what's called a disconnect automatically when it reached one of those limits. When that system broke, the boom does manual override so that when it gets to one of those limits, he automatically disconnects from the receiver. Manual boom latching is where the receiver can manually lock on to the nozzle with his system, and the receiver punches himself off the boom, or the boom operator can punch him off. If you get a pressure disconnect, that means the system senses that the tanks are full and it automatically fires a disconnect. In this case, if that system again is broken, you do manual boom latching where both the boom operator and the receiver go, okay, I'm full, bing, push the button, and they disconnect from each other. The second item that was in the directive was for those airplanes that are supporting Chrome Dome missions, if there's an abort on the runway during takeoff or soon after launch, they can launch one of their ground alert PSYOP airplanes to replace it. They wanted to keep all of the missions flowing, and they were allowed to use ground alert airplanes that were specifically tasked for the single integrated operations plan go to war with Russia aircraft that were on alert. And one of the things that you have to remember about all this, folks, all of these buff and tanker sorties were not part of the PSYOP. This was all in addition to the PSYOP because the Chrome Dome bombers had specific targets that they would go after, and they were not PSYOP type of targets. This created kind of a headache for all of the armament crews because the B-52s were carrying either 4 Mark 28 or 2 Mark 15/39 nukes. They have either a contact fuse, a delay fuse, or an airburst fuse. Some of them have all 3. So you had to be careful of having a PSYOP airplane fly a Chrome Dome mission that it had the right type of weapons on board, which taxed the weapons folks even more. With all of these B-52s flying, it created gaps in the Single Integrated Operations Plan, the PSYOP, the regular nuclear go-to-war program. B-47s were used to fill in some of those gaps, as well as B-58 Hustlers. At the time, there was a program that they called Reflex Alert, where the B-47s would deploy overseas to Morocco, Spain, Great Britain, and Guam with their accompanying tankers with nuclear weapons on board in the travel configuration until they got to those locations. Again, country clearance comes into play here because you have to tell Morocco, Spain, and the UK, hey, we're putting airplanes on nuclear alert on your soil. They were able to juggle the PSYOP targets and the Chrome Dome targets by placing some of the B-52s that are on reflex alert and targeting them towards some of these PSYOP targets that the B-52s were supposed to strike. Before the Cuban Missile Crisis struck, 6 B-58 Hustlers, brand new strategic bombers for the Strategic Air Command, 6 of them were on alert. 3 at Bunker Hill in Indiana, now Grissom Air Force Base, and 3 more down at Carswell Air Force Base in Texas. By the first week of November, all 84 B-58s are now on alert. 20 of those 84 B-58 missions are now tasked with PSYOP missions. Again, they're trying to fill in the PSYOP gaps. The B-58 carries 1 to 4 nuclear bombs, but requires KC-135 to refuel it because it's so dang fast. So 20 more KC-135s were sent to the Northeast bases, strictly tasked to refuel the B-58 on its PSYOP mission. By the 4th of November, there's 1,479 strike aircraft on alert, ready to go with an hour's notice. Those 1,479 strike aircraft are carrying a total of 2,962 nuclear weapons. Almost 3,000 nuclear weapons are out there on alert. While in this DEFCON 2 position, SAC had 92.5% of its assets on some type of alert, ready to go within an hour. Folks, this is incredible. This is unprecedented. 3,000 nuclear weapons ready to go with 60 minutes notice. And to make sure that the reflex alert B-47s had enough gas, 41 KC-97s found Goose Bay, Labrador as their new home. 34 went to Harmon Air Force Base, and 12 of them were at lodges to refuel those that were in Spain and Morocco. Strategic Air Command is spread out all over everywhere. And you've got all of the tankers that are supporting operations in and around Cuba because the RB-47s, the reconnaissance airplanes need fuel, and some of the other strike airplanes that are going into Cuba, all of these fighters that are now in Florida will also need some kind of gas. I mean, it's incredible when you look at all this stuff, what SAC had to do during this time period. During this 30-day time period, 2,088 B-52 aircraft launched on Chrome Dome missions. Total flying hours was 47,168. They had a 97% in commission rate. In other words, 97% of the airplanes took off and performed their missions. At the peak of the Cuban crisis, there may have been as many as 65 B-52s airborne during any given time period. And of course, they require a lot of gas. In the November timeframe, tankers were flying 133 missions a day. And assuming that they were offloading 105,000 pounds of gas, that means in 30 days, they offloaded 414 million pounds of jet fuel, averaging about 14 million pounds a day. By comparison, the shock and awe campaign lasts, I think, 26 days. And during that time period, 100 tankers offloaded 417,123,000 pounds of gas. So they're very comparable, but we weren't using as many tankers in the shock and awe campaign. But of course, we're using our models too, which are so gas efficient. I just wanted to give you a comparison of here is an actual wartime comparison of shock and awe, 417 million pounds to the 414 million pounds in 30 days during the Cuban Missile Crisis. At the peak of the crisis, according to this Strategic Air Command ops during the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1,003 tankers, KC-97s, KB-50s, KC-135s, all on some type of alert status or in the air. After doing a little research, I've actually found a great article in Smithsonian Magazine back in 2006 that kind of gives you an idea of what these Chrome Dome missions are like. When you're in the air for 24 hours, there is a lot of boredom. And remember, I told you the definition of flying is long periods of boredom interrupted by short intermittent periods of extreme terror. Let me read to you from this particular article by Bill Robinson in September of 2006 in his article called A Hard Day's Night. He is a first lieutenant flying B-52s out of Larson Air Force Base, which I believe is in Washington State somewhere, and I can't remember where. He's flying a B-52D. His call sign is Ranger 42. They're in cell with another airplane, Ranger 41. And he takes off on January 5th, 1966. Now, I realize there's like a 4-year difference between the two events, the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, and this mission he's talking about. But he's flying the north route, which didn't change a whole lot. So let me read to you some of the things that he says in this article. Really fascinating article. Go and find it. And if you just put up A Hard Day's Night Chrome Dome in Google, it'll come right up. They take off out of Washington and head across the United States. He says in the article, over Pennsylvania, the flight took up an east-northeast heading for our rendezvous with a pair of KC-135 tankers in the Black Goat refueling area off of Newfoundland. Each bomber would take on about 12,500 gallons of fuel, enough to carry us over the pole and down to our next refueling over central Alaska. And here's an interesting thing you have to do when you're flying over the pole when you don't have GPS. Remember, this is 1966. We're using electromechanical type instruments inside the airplane. At 60 degrees north latitude, south of Cape Dyer in the Arctic Circle, it was time to go into grid, an air navigation technique used in the polar regions where the unreliability of the magnetic compass and the acute convergence of geographical lines of longitude and meridians close to the pole rule out steering by conventional methods. On normal polar charts, the convergence of meridians close to the pole causes 1 degree of change in true course for each meridian passed. This change occurs more rapidly the closer the aircraft comes to the pole. The practical effect of this is that in order to fly a straight course, the aircraft would have to be placed in a constant turn. Not good. To solve the problem, grid navigation necessitates reorientation of the aircraft's heading reference to a false north, what we refer to as grid north, by replacing the polar chart with a chart containing a square latitude and longitude grid. Because the meridians on the new grid chart were parallel to the Greenwich meridian, angle between north and true north could be calculated and a new geographic heading reference established. Once this new heading reference was resolved, the aircraft's primary compass was switched to a gyro-stabilized free running mode, then simply reset and maintained on the new grid heading. When I was in Strategic Air Command flying KC-135s in the 80s, 85 through 90, we always did a nav leg, and we did it in grid. Every navigator had to know how to do this grid checklist of going into grid, coming out of grid, flying in grid, taking celestial shots of stars through a sextant port, just like Magellan navigated when he was making his famous ocean crossings. What I'm saying is 20 years later, we were still using this same method. We had to train to this grid north polar line thing in case we went to war with Russia, because again, in the 80s, late 80s, we were still on alert. He goes on to say in the article, after passing Thule, we were ready to quote unquote coast out over the ice. It was 400 miles to our turn point at 80 degrees north latitude, where we would begin the 1,000-mile southbound leg headed for our coast in at Point Barrow, Alaska. At this point, the only reliable means of navigation was celestial, done by taking star sightings and plotting fixes while flying at 7 miles per minute. Flying over the Arctic had an element of the mystical. Undulating curtain-like displays of the aurora borealis, the northern lights, seemed close enough to touch. Every so often, St. Elmo's fire gave the engine nacelles, wing leading edges, and windscreen pillars of spooky blue glow. Been there, done that, seen it. Occasional commentary among the pilots and gunner on the marvels of the Arctic night at 41,000 feet were interspersed by the radar navigator's report of possible polar bear and seal sightings as he surveyed the ice through the optical bomb sight, cranked up to maximum magnification for enhanced sightseeing in the bright moonlight. As riveting as the Arctic show was, I was occupied with making 3 star fixes, heading shots, gyro compass precession corrections. The routine was to shoot and plot each fix, adjust the airspeed and heading to stay on time and on track, while a heading shot and a reset the heading on the gyro compass, calculate the plot, the new assumed position for the next fix, then begin the process all over again every 20 minutes. Do you see how boring this can be? Except for the navigator. The pilots are just flying whatever the navigator tells them to, but the nav is staying pretty busy when they're on this northern route, particularly near the poles. Bill Robinson goes on to say, after our turn at 89 North, the electronic warfare officer detected friendly and unfriendly distant early warning radars tracking us. He briefly tuned his receiving gear to listen in on the Soviet defense early warning line guys talking to one another and wondering out loud if they were discussing us. Since I spoke a little Russian, I listened in via an intercom jack to see if I could get the gist of their conversation. Everyone got a chuckle when I told the crew that the Soviet operators were playing chess. So Bill Robinson, this first lieutenant navigator, goes on to say, at 200 miles from Alaska's north coast, I took my last celestial fix, and the moment of truth, landfall, was upon me. Squinting over my oxygen mask into the orange sweep of the radar scope, can you imagine having an oxygen mask on for 24 to 27 hours? I knew that Point Barrow's little cluster of buildings would give a small but distinct return. Although I had been on this way before, a twinge of apprehension reminded me of a kinship with maritime navigators of old, who surely had similar feelings as they made landfall after long voyages. In other words, people like Magellan. In a few minutes, Point Barrow popped up right where it was supposed to be. When the co-pilot tuned the radio direction finder receiver to the local radio station for a confirmation bearing, we heard the mamas and the papas welcoming us to Alaska with California dreaming. Our final refueling with a KC-135 from Eielson Air Force Base was in the Cold Coffee track, abeam Mount McKinley. We had been flying for 15 hours, covering nearly 7,000 miles. At a pressurized cockpit altitude of 12,000 feet, everyone was a little dehydrated, the coffee was history, the water stale, and our teeth felt like they were growing fur. Only 9 hours to go! After a final lead change, I could relax a little. Tired but not sleepy, I moved up to keep the pilot's seat warm, giving him the opportunity to stretch out on the deck for a nap after his refueling exertions. The electronic warfare officer gave our post-refueling report to the Strategic Air Command Post at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. The radar navigator monitored Ranger 41's electronic beacon on his radar scope to maintain our position 2 miles behind him, and the gunner started playing with a magazine that is not suitable for work. I'll just leave it at that. You guys know what I'm talking about. I joined the co-pilot in dining on a couple of semi-petrified pieces of cold sack fried chicken purloined from the alert facility mess hall 18 hours earlier. Munching on our drumsticks, we were content. World War III hadn't started, and it was beginning to look like the world and the Ranger flight might make it through another day. We cruised out beyond the Alaska west coast, just north of the Aleutian chain, then reverse course, heading toward our turn point off Kodiak Island for the final leg, along the Canadian west coast, and then home to Larson. After touchdown, 24 hours, 10 minutes after wheels up, our squadron mates aboard Soapy 2-1 and 2-2 were already airborne, taking our place on their own odyssey across the top of the world. I had a lot of KC-135 missions that were over 10 hours long. I think my longest was over 15. And we would bring all kinds of stuff with us into the cockpit to keep us occupied. As a fairly new co-pilot, I stayed pretty busy monitoring the fuel panel, making sure the center of gravity was good, burning the right tanks, and I stayed pretty busy for the most part. The navigator on the KC-135 always stayed busy, making sure that we were on time, on center line. We were going to make all of our timing to our air refueling control points. The boom operator was usually in the back, sleeping on one of the cots, or he or she was just in the chair reading something too. Yes, we had things to eat. We had box lunches that we would bring with us. We actually had a snack box lunch that we could order so that we could call in the day before a flight and say, hey, I want my snack box lunch number 2. Buck Becker, one of our co-pilots at Pease, had 50 ho-hos and 12 cartons of milk in his snack box. Got himself all sugared up on his flights with his snack box. But those are some of the things that we did on these missions. And that's a typical Northern Route B-52 mission, albeit 4 years apart. Crews would do the same things on their missions up to the North Pole and then back home. Everybody understands the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but Strategic Air Command kept this pace up for 30 days, as I mentioned before. 30 days of this increased operational tempo is taxing on everybody. The air crews, the maintainers, the weapons loaders, the security folks, even the people that are making the box lunches have to go 24 hours around the clock. And you're just tired. It's just exhausting. You sleep on the plane or try to, but again, you're on an airplane. I cannot sleep on an airplane. I can close my eyes. My mind keeps going because all of the things that are going on around me, you're still listening to the radios, you're still having to make reports, and it's still pretty boring. Long periods of boredom interrupted by short intermittent periods of extreme terror. And in the KC-135, I didn't have an EWO that could listen to the Russians playing chess. On the 21st of November at 06Z or 2 a.m., Strategic Air Command came off of the 1/8 alert, airborne alert. We went to maximum ground alert at that time period as the bombers came back from their Chrome Dome missions. They were regenerated and put on this maximum ground alert status. So from reading all of this, what are some of my lessons learned? I've already mentioned some of the logistical ones. Dealing with 3 different tankers, 2 of them reciprocating engines, refueling jet fighters that require a different kind of fuel. In order to maintain and sustain high tempo tanker operations, you have to do it from prepared military or international airports because you can't bunker enough gas. During Operation Iraqi Freedom, we ran the United Arab Emirates out of gas. They were not capable of making the amount of jet fuel we were using at Al Dhafra in a single day. We had to come up with a really unique way of maintaining gas at Al Dhafra, and that was bring in one of those super tankers full of jet fuel. And we were within a few days of emptying it. Another lesson learned. You had jet aircraft refueling from prop-driven aircraft. We were just coming out of the propeller-driven aircraft age into the jet age, and we still had disparities in performance. KC-97s could only top out at their max gross weight between 21,000 and 18,000 feet, which meant B-47s had to come down from 36,000 feet, refuel, and then burn a whole bunch of gas going back up to their cruising altitude of 36,000 feet. It was just the nature of operations at the time in the early 60s. We had propeller-driven airplanes and we had jet engine airplanes. And they worked it out. It's a planning nightmare when you have one tanker that actually has to have separate tanks of jet fuel and avgas, but you work it out. One of the other lessons learned is we really didn't have to deal with the tyranny of distance where operations over Cuba was concerned. Homestead to Cuba, I think, is only 90 miles. McCoy at Orlando, MacDill at Tampa, again, not that far. So you didn't need a lot of tankers. Now, if there had been an invasion, it would have been completely different. The airstrikes that we would have had to perform, the first to take down the entire Cuban air defense network with their long and target tracking radars, the SA-2s, guns. More airplanes are shot down by guns than with SAMs. That had to go into effect. You had to bomb the runways where the fighters and the bombers were. You had to make sure that they didn't have a first strike capability, and you had to take out all of these medium and intermediate range ballistic missile sites. And even Curtis LeMay said, we may not get them all on the first day, which is kind of disconcerting because that means they may retain a first strike capability for 24, 48 hours. Who knows? We didn't have the intelligence collection capability that we do now with satellites and drones with warheads that we can just drop on these sites with great precision. We didn't have any of that. All of this was free fall weapons. Laser guided bombs were still 4 to 6 years in the distance. 1970, 1972 is when we first started using laser guided bombs and testing them. GPS guided weapons didn't come until, a decade and a half later. There was a lot of things that we had to do, and going into grid because we don't have GPS guidance. We don't have a GPS constellation up over our heads. And most of you can't even imagine driving some long distance without looking up the address or the town that you're going to when you're on vacation or just driving to go see somebody. All of us can bring GPS up on our phone. We didn't have that artificial celestial constellation that guides us now in everything that we do. We were using stars the same way Magellan, Columbus, Cortez were using on their long distance boat rides across the Atlantic. So at the end of this episode, I just want to say something to all of you who are out there that participated in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I salute you. You did incredible work to keep World War III from potentially happening. And we hear now, oh my gosh, Ukraine and Russia, there could be World War III. They want fighters. They want all this, Putin's on edge, all these different things. We're seeing kind of the same kind of world situation. And those of you that participated in the Cuban Missile Crisis kept the world from going to war. And we salute you. The Department of Defense, particularly the Department of State, and all of the background negotiations that they made behind the scenes. And if you go see the movie 13 Days, it's portrayed real well in there. There was these backdoor negotiations that were going on when we found Nikita Khrushchev was friends of a friend of a friend, and we were able to send communiques through them and bring this to a halt. But remember, Strategic Air Command's patch had a gauntlet fist on it with lightning bolts. And that's the one thing that President Kennedy, and in fact all presidents, have as an ace in the hole when things might be getting really sour, that they can launch a low observable bomber out of Whiteman Air Force Base that's carrying multiple GPS guided weapons to go and smack down some enemy that's threatening us with nuclear weapons. To you, Cuban Missile Crisis veterans, we all salute you. And it was so much fun researching this and giving you, my listeners, a look at Strategic Air Command operations during the Cuban crisis of 1962. I hope you've enjoyed this episode on Strategic Air Command operations during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Folks, reading the Strategic Air Command ops report, I'm going to link to that document so that you can pull it up online, those of you that are interested, and read it. It's really fascinating. I mean, think about it, folks. There's 1,000 tankers on alert, 1,003 to be exact, on alert during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, just amazing stuff. This episode is financed by Wall Pilot, custom aviation art for the walls of your home, office, or hangar. Please go to wallpilot.com and look through the 127 ready-to-print 4-foot, 6-foot, and 8-foot profiles of famous aircraft that you can peel off and stick to any flat surface. We also do custom aviation art. If there's a particular airplane you want with your name on it, a particular weapons load from a particular unit with tail number, we can do that. Go to wallpilot.com and order a couple of these very detailed profile drawings, because that supports us here on the Lessons from the Cockpit show with all of our monthly expenses. I really appreciate all of you taking the time to tune in and listen and download these. You can download and listen to this episode and previous episodes of the Lessons from the Cockpit show on my website at markhasera.com under the podcast pull-down box. Again, thanks for tuning in, and we look forward to talking to you next week on the Lessons from the Cockpit show. Go by Wall Pilot and take a look at some of our profiles or order a custom one for your wall. Looking forward to doing one of those for you. Take care, folks, and have a great week.